Jakob studied history and the philosophy of science at University College London. He then did a 2-year master's over at NYU, and now he is studying for his doctorate in philosophy here at the University of Oxford, where he's working on Martin Heidegger, I believe under the supervision of Joseph Scheer, is that right?
Yep.
But today he's going to talk to us about the importance of Buddhist ethics, so please give him a very warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Since we just heard a lot of illuminating things about Hegel, thanks to you, Michael, I want to start this talk with that philosopher who Richard Rorty has called the greatest Western philosopher since Hegel, which is Martin Heidegger. And I want to use Heidegger because I think that in his history of being, we find a very relevant and pertinent, if also slightly too abstract, which is often the case for Heidegger and Hegel for that matter, analysis of what Heidegger calls the Neuzeit, the new age within which we dwell. Against the backdrop of this historical analysis of our current condition, I then want to proceed by asking how and what this analysis can contribute as a means for illuminating ethical developments over the period identified by Heidegger. In what sense does it help us understand large-scale decisions about what is good or bad, what to value, and thus what life to lead? And what I want to suggest is that Heidegger's analysis, although partially helpful in understanding long-term historical and political developments, is unable to capture what I call radical subjectivity, the age of complete individualization and, more importantly, the ability to affirm that individualization through the acknowledgement of a global audience partaking via new technological methods of communication. It is in this completely new environment that I think Buddhist ethics plays as important a role as ever, for it starts at what I take to be the only plausible starting point, at an affirmation of each individual's radical individuality, although, as we well know, it reveals the latter as a grand illusion. So let's begin by taking a brief look at Heidegger's history of being and the place that he assigns to the Neuzeit, which is the time we live in that essay. A central piece to refer to for our purposes is the well-known Age of the Worldview essay, where we find the following claims being staked. In the great age of the Greeks, Heidegger proposes, there simply was no distinction between man and that which is, in the sense that man was born alongside entities, dwelling amongst them and not seeing himself as their originator or lord. This is the moment of unity between subject and object that Hegel aspires to in the phenomenology, and it is also the moment before the Urteil, the primordial separation, that Hölderlin so often refers to in his poems. Now what Heidegger here calls the great age of the Greeks is of course the time before Plato enters the scene to define being as idea or eidos, which means aspect or view, which Heidegger thinks is the crucial turning point that sets into motion the inevitable journey towards modern metaphysics, which we will get to in a second. For by defining being as idea, Plato has effectively posited the need for some kind of entity through whose view or will entities appear as the entities they are. Thus, in the Middle Ages, Christianity continues in its Platonic tradition by positing the creator God as that entity through which all others are being assigned their specific rank. And, crucially for our purposes today, René Descartes continues in his Platonic tradition by placing man in the space reserved for God in the Christian system. For it is Descartes who in 1641 first speaks of man as subject, and thus begins to conceive our role in the following way, and I quote Heidegger. When man becomes the primary and only real subjectum, that means that man becomes the being upon which all that is grounded as regards the manner of its being and its truth. Man becomes the relational center of that which is as such. And it is this, our position as subjects in the world, that concerns me here today. Because, and I again want to read out what I take to be perhaps the most forceful passage in the whole Age of the Worldview piece. So this is Heidegger again. Only because and insofar as man actually and essentially has become subject, is it necessary for him, as a consequence, to confront the explicit question, is it as an I confined to its own preferences and freed into its own arbitrary choosing, or as the we of society? Is it as an individual or as a community? Is it as a personality within the community or as a mere group member in the corporate body? Is it as a state and nation and as a people, or as the common humanity of modern man? That man will and ought to be the subject, then in his modern essence, he already is. So Heidegger here presents us with the origin of the two conflicting positions in modern moral philosophy. The interest of the individual versus the interests of the community. For it is only where man is essentially already subject that there exists the possibility of his slipping into the aberration of subjectivism in the sense of individualism. And it is also only where man is subject that the positive struggle against individualism and for the community, as a sphere of those goals that govern all achievement and usefulness, can have any meaning. And so I want to, at this point, leave Heidegger and see what use we can extract from his template. A first thing to notice here is that as a result of the world being grounded upon man, as the representatio of the latter, the apprehension of things as having a divine character, in the sense of being in sheer awe over their existence, what the great Greeks refer to with the word taumatsein, as well as the urge to posit a divine source of inspiration for the wondrous character of the world, as in Heidegger's example of Christianity, has become obsolete. If it is man who resides at the foundation of the world, then the most pressing issue becomes man's self-realization. And so I think it is plausible to suggest that with the advent of subjectivity, the most fundamental ethical question about how to lead one's life after the Nietzschean death of God was, historically speaking, initially answered in favor of communal projects. For it is in any kind of communal fulfillment that man is still represented with at least the relic of the idea of something higher than its own individual self. On a scale ranging from poly or monotheistic conceptions of the world, right to the existentialism of the late 19th of early 20th centuries, a sudden shift from one extreme to the other would have seemed like too drastic a move. And so what I want to propose in the next paragraph is the idea that the concept of the nation-state has assumed a kind of in-between position in the transition from a God-centered universe to one founded on the premises of radical subjectivity. What seems most astonishing from a contemporary perspective is at first the sheer conviction with which individuals are ready to sacrifice their lives in honor of communal ideals. Looking at a number of large-scale political events from around the middle of the 17th century, whether it is the American War of Independence, the French Revolution and Napoleonic era shortly afterwards, or the founding of the German Empire in 1871, we observe the affirmation of collective values over and above the fate of individuals. But it is not only in matters of life and death where the sensus communis, as Kant says, seems to have reigned supreme. In the German literature of the Goethe-Zeit, for instance, we find the key writers and philosophers concerned with an elaboration of what it means to be German, articulating and constituting the commoning to being of a national self-consciousness, whose amplification often trumps individual or personal concerns. It's a recurring theme in Hegel, Goethe, Schiller, and so forth. Yet when we keep in line with Hegel's dialectical method, we should come to expect the other extreme, what I've called radical subjectivity, to regain force, in light of the supremacy of communal ideals. And so I want to spend the second half of this talk looking at how I think ethical decisions about how to live are more and more answered in favor of individualist pursuits, suggesting why this might be the case. I then want to end by turning towards Buddhist ethics as that ethical system that looks to me to be the most promising given our current ideological climate. The last historical example I briefly listed was the German unification of 1871. And given the rather substantial amount of significant events that have occurred in the 20th century, I actually don't have the resources nor time to give some kind of intelligible or coherent account of how this shift in preferences exactly came about. So allow me to skip this part of the analysis and fast forward right to our current day and the main events preoccupying us here. About 3 weeks ago, a delegation consisting of the French Prime Minister François Hollande, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko were gathering in Belarus in an attempt to find a solution to the ongoing conflict between Russian separatists and Ukrainians in the eastern part of Ukraine. What they achieved was by no means spectacular, but at least a slight glimmer of hope in the attempt to resolve the situation peacefully. The countries agreed, among other things, that a ceasefire would come into force at midnight on Saturday, the 14th of February of this year. Yet on Sunday, the 15th of February, the day after the truce had come into action, a small group of rebels went on to attack and seize the town of Debaltseve. Despite an agreement between four major powers being in place, a handful of individuals had taken matters into their own hands by disregarding international law and proceeding according to their own standards of action. In a not too unrelated manner, the terrorist attacks by Islamist extremists are the work of a rather small amount of people who've interpreted the writings of the Quran in a very idiosyncratic and uncommon way to effectively further the peculiar and narrow ideological conceptions. We again see individuals taking it upon themselves to decide the right course of action over and against the wider interest of the larger Islamic community. Now, what's peculiar about these incidents is not their actual occurrence. It would be preposterous to argue that there have never before been cases of breaches in ceasefire agreements, or of religious dissidents killing others in the apparent name of God. What is unique and novel about these events, I believe, is the ability of the participants to broadcast their minority views to a large global audience. It is through the interconnectedness of all these individual nods to each other, and by extension to everyone in possession of a smart device, which is about 80% of the Western world at this point, that what would formerly have been extreme minority positions are now showcased and acknowledged by a huge set of people. We're all well aware of the gruesome videos or pictures being taken and uploaded by proponents of the Islamic State movement, or of the Russian separatists shooting down a commercial airliner and popularizing their deeds on Twitter. What's more, global news organizations are quick to pick up on this content, spiraling through social media, thus turning these actions into the main events of the day by assigning them headline positions on their sites. Now, one doesn't need to be acquainted with the overwhelming emphasis Hegel assigns to recognition, as we just heard, to appreciate the profound impact this change in our technological abilities has on the structure of our society. We're moving from an age in which the ability to create and distribute information was in the hands of a few, to one in which every individual has the power to broadcast and share his opinions, regardless of the content which they contain, and in whatever form they may come. We're moving from an age, that is, in which ideology took the form of a more or less homogeneous and coherent set of assumptions, to one in which the world spirit is more than ever characterized by fragmentation and differences. This is what I call the age of radical subjectivity, the age in which every individual has the power to get his particular viewpoint acknowledged and recognized by all the other selves with which he is in continuous and permanent connection. This cements and completes the rise of the subject, which for the first time has the ability to have its subjectivity affirmed and witnessed for by the masses. Now, this sort of radical subjectivity and the underlying technological changes that enable it encourage that particular stance that I believe makes Buddhism such a strong ethical alternative. For what is continuously being nourished and promoted is a continuous questioning that reinserts a highly increased awareness of self into everyday life and activities. Questions of the kind: how am I feeling today? What do I want to get out of this day or life? What role or position do I play in such and such a situation or context? Abound in today's world. And it seems to me that this very attitude towards the world is not too far at all from the initial focus in meditation, at least based on the limited personal experience I've had. For whenever one sits down in meditation, the attempt is to come back to oneself, to take a moment to acknowledge how one is feeling today, right now, in this particular moment. What is my breath like today? Are there any underlying tensions in my shoulders? Where in my body could I locate that sense of confusion, anxiety, or happiness? Now, of course, this kind of practice is very much intended in a non-conceptual way. The attempt is not to answer these questions verbally, as it were, but rather to really try to feed into one's bodily sensations in each particular moment. Yet still, I think that there's something very convincing and promising about this approach, exactly because it is so intuitive and in vogue with the general climate of our subjective times. As philosophers well know, one of the great challenges in any attempt to devise an ethical system is the search for what John Rawls called the original position, a starting position that is designed to be fair and impartial point of view, which could in principle be accepted by all participants. And the Buddhist answer, start by acknowledging however you yourself might be feeling in this particular moment, appears to me to fulfill that criterion. Yet it also, and more importantly, shows us a way in which we can, after a great amount of practice involving a continuous de-identification from and distinction of the thoughts and events of one's day, with the ability to undergo these very thoughts and events, the distinction between the awareness dimension and whatever might be the experiences occurring in the latter, arrive at the realization that the awareness of presence dimension is something we each share. And thus that distinctions in subjective experiences, which might lead us to act hostile towards one another, are the result of an illusory sense of self that has turned us into the individuals and distinct creatures we fundamentally are not. In this way, it provides us an incredibly powerful solution to one of the most pressing ethical questions in the age of radical subjectivity. How can we get to a position of mutual agreement in a world whose ideological character is becoming ever more fragmented? Thank you.